You've seen this chart before. What I'm hoping to do is to show you that this is not a confusing chart. It's very, very informative in many, many different ways. Very quickly, let's review some things that are associated with this chart, which is dealing with the documentary hypothesis. J refers to one of the sources that was available, a written source, E to a source that was available, which were combined into a given source called the JE source. This is the Yahweh source, the Elohim source. This was a written document that was available at the time the Torah was put together, written document that was available. It came from the southern tribe of Judah, largely, and covered a period of maybe about 100 years or so, largely centered around the time of Solomon when it was written. The Elohist was written about 100 years later by the northern tribes. But both of these books, most of these sources, give quite a bit of details about some of the things that happened historically and were combined into a JE or a combined source. They were coupled with P, which is a priestly source. This priestly source was not written until about the time of Hezekiah, about 700 BC, and it was combined with the JE source and made into the Torah. But don't forget this. You'll notice that each one of these is designated with an arrow saying the redactor. These were all redacted. Even the book of Deuteronomy was redacted. What does redacted mean? It means it was edited in a very interesting fashion that we'll talk about a bit later. Now I did it. What is the book of Deuteronomy all about? Can you figure out what Deutero means? It means two. The book of Deuteronomy is the second reading of the law. Actually, it comes on the scene a little bit later than some of the earlier readings of the law, which we'll talk about later on. But for the most part, what the book of Deuteronomy is going to do is give us a sermon that Moses had given to the Israelites just before they went across the Jordan River to go into Canaan. They are given instructions. The instructions are, here are some commandments, and if you follow these commandments, things will go well for you, and this promised land of Canaan will be your promised land, as long as you follow the commandments. Like I said, Deuteronomy means, actually the main part is not this, is this sermon in terms of the law. This is from Deuteronomy. This is what it says. Now, this is the commandment, the statutes and ordinances which the Lord your God commanded me to teach you, that you may do them, and the word to which you are, into the land in which you are going to possess it. That you may fear the Lord your God, and you and your son and your son's son, etc., may have days, long days in the land. Hear therefore, O Israel, be careful to do them, that it may be well with you, that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you in this land of milk and honey. It's very, very, very succinctly stated that here is the law. These are the commands. This is the way that you should live. If you follow these things, you're going to be able to exist happily in the land. This supposedly was delivered by Moses when he was on Mount Nebo. This is just before Moses died. Moses, you know, never did get into Canaan. He never got to the promised land itself. Here he is looking it over. And we'll go back to this documentary hypothesis, and we're going to say a little bit more about it. You notice in this section, now we can leave this part of this diagram alone and just concentrate on this small part. You notice that the Deuteronomy is indicated as DTR1, Deuteronomy 1 and Deuteronomy 2. Deuteronomy 1 was the original book of Deuteronomy and actually was only about, I think it was 11 or 12 to 26, just certain chapters that were found in the temple. I think you all remember that story of how one of the kings, Josiah, was having the temple renovated, and in the renovation of the temple they came across this document. That was DRT1, or Deuteronomy 1. All it was a set of laws. That's all it was. But it resulted in causing a Deuteronomy 2 to be written to explain where this set of laws had come from, and also to serve as a means of giving a complete book of Deuteronomy, which then became a very important part of the Deuteronomic history. Now, what do we mean by the Deuteronomic history? It means the 6 books that follow the book of Deuteronomy as we find it in our Bible. That's Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. And what we find is that we do get a detailed account of the history of the Jews in that period. This Deuteronomic history, I would say, without hesitation, contains some of the most familiar parts of the Bible as far as the Old Testament is concerned for most of us who are Christians. It has all the stories that you're familiar with, all the stories all the way from the time of the falling of the walls of Jericho to the time of Samson and Delilah and Gideon, into the time of Samuel as a boy, into the time when Saul was made king, and then David was made king, and the things that happened in David's life and what happened later on, all the way up until around 609 BC, when one of these kings, Josiah, was killed in a battle, which we'll get into. But it covers this history very nicely. As we go through it, we will talk once in a while about who may actually have written the parts of those history. The Deuteronomic history as we find it in the Bible was written by the Deuteronomist, who made use of material that he had available to him. He had lots of material available to him, and some of this is listed. For example, we get an awful lot about what went on in a place called Shiloh and a man called Samuel. Well, Samuel was also a prophet who had been educated and was capable of writing. He very likely was the one that wrote big parts of the Deuteronomic history. Later on, we find in the Deuteronomic history the story of David's family. We find what they call the court history. The court history involves David falling in love with Bathsheba, Absalom killing his brother Ammon, who had raped his sister. In other words, all of the intimate details of this family. Where did they come from? They came from the court history. Another source that this historian, this Deuteronomic historian, had available to him and incorporated in that fashion. Later on, we get a lot of stories about Elijah. Here again, we wonder, where did they come from? Who wrote those stories? How did this Deuteronomic historian have that kind of information available to him to put this history together? If we take a look at that DRT1 and DTR1 and DTR2, when we mention that DTR1 is that it's called the Deuteronomic Code. It's these chapters starting, I think, from 11 through 26 that are a listing of all the things that they should be doing and should not be doing in terms of being able to live according to God's commandments. I'm going to say practically nothing about it today because next week is going to be just looking at the code itself. But the additions that we have, the DTR2, are rather important. The first part, in the first 11 chapters or so, we get a great big historical review of everything that had happened to the Jews from the time that they had come to the land of Jordan, come to the shore of Jordan, were ready to cross over, back to the time that they had left Egypt. And actually it works history a little bit backwards here. We're accustomed to the idea of history progressing from the beginning to the end. This one starts with the end and goes to the beginning. I'll say a little bit about that later on because there's a very interesting aspect to this that some people forget, and I'll tell you what it is. one of the commentators that I read, it was a guy named Friedman, he said that what we have in this Deuteronomy is a listing of the things that had happened in a chronological order. It is backwards from the order that we would like. If we were to talk about American history right now, we would not start out by saying, well, American history starts with the presidential election of 2020 and then work back to the Mayflower. We start from the beginning. Deuteronomy does the other way. It starts from the time that they're at Jordan, ready to cross over into Canaan, back to when they left Egypt and what they had gone through until they got to Egypt. Also included in those first edition is the ethical code. It's the 10 Commandments. How many of you are aware that you can find the 10 Commandments in two very different places in the Old Testament? Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. I'll get into that a little bit later because they are almost identical. They're exactly the same except different. How do you like that? There are little differences that are very telling in that. The last part, after Deuteronomy 26, we get some things that happened in terms of the death of Moses and the death and the I'll say it. I can't see reading it. Oh, the death and burial of Moses, and the fact that Joshua was appointed as Moses' successor. Here are some time considerations that we ought to keep in mind. I have found that looking into finding when things actually happen in terms of what you find on the internet can be very useful because you can get almost any date you want. Nobody seems to settle too much on some of these dates, but there are some dates where we can feel a certain amount of confidence. This book of Deuteronomy, for the reasons that we have in terms of its history, we almost have to conclude that it probably was written sometime around 640 BC. It was written around 640 BC by a very special group of people that we'll spend a lot of time talking about, or called the Shilohist priests. The around 640 BC. The Deuteronomic history, after the book of Deuteronomy, after those first chapters had been put together, and then the supplemental work had been put together, it was decided that we ought to have our whole history. Now the reason for this is much more apparent when we study the history itself, which we'll do sometime later this spring. The reason for this, this was a period that was very special in terms of the history of the Jews in this regard. There was a very strong feeling of nationalism. They wanted to be a nation again. They wanted to be like they were at the time of David, when there was actually a larger kingdom that held some sway in the world. They wanted to get back to that. Now, what made them think they could do that? Because of the fact that the great Assyrian Empire, which was controlling the world for a long time, was falling apart. And they felt that with the Assyrian Empire falling apart, they might have the opportunity to reestablish themselves as a united kingdom. And there was a fairly high degree of nationalism that started to develop among the Jews, and particularly by Josiah. And what we find is that Deuteronomic history that we have goes all the way from the time that the book of Deuteronomy comes into play, namely when Moses is talking to the Israelites about going into Canaan, all the way up to the death of Josiah, who was their king, who was killed. That is the first part of the Deuteronomic history. After, and there are two chapters that follow that are added that take us beyond this to the point where the Jews had lost their king, but they were also conquered by the Babylonians and taken into exile, and goes all the way into around 560 BC. But we get a very good outline of history here from the standpoint not of the history that we would like all the time, but the history in terms of what was the relationship that these people had with their God. How did their affinity with their God play such an important role in the history that actually developed? let me take a look at the next slide here. The Deuteronomic Code I mentioned before, that covers just certain chapters. That was the first book that was discovered in the temple, just those laws. Like I said, we'll talk about that later on. This particular sentence right here I think is rather important, and I'll say more about it next week. Before we go any further, I think it's rather essential that we get something defined, and that is what we mean by the Torah. I already mentioned this morning that the Torah really means the law. And as far as the Jews are concerned, even to this very day, those 5 books, which are often called the books of Moses, are also referred to as the books of the law, because they do have the law in them. Where did this Torah come from? Well, we've talked about this documentary hypothesis several times. The Torah in your Bible are the first 5 books that you have in the Old Testament. They were not the first 5 books that appeared as such in the Old Testament. They actually did not appear as a Torah until maybe about 400 BC. But they were composed of some earlier documents, of this J, E, and P documents. What had happened after the exile, after the Babylonians were put out of power and the Persians were now in control, the Persians were very lenient and allowed the Jews to go back to Jerusalem if they wanted to, and allowed them to develop their own religion. It was probably during this time that somebody decided, we've got to look at those books that we have available, the J, the E, and the P, and have them available for people to read. But if they read them, they're going to find out they contradict each other once in a while. They're not exactly the same. And what this person did, what this redactor did, we'll call him a redactor, this editor did, is took upon himself a very interesting task of taking these 3 very different sources in some ways, but very similar in other ways, and try to make them into one unit. And he succeeded. He succeeded in being able to write the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers all as a single unit, as a single story. If you recall, when we were going through Genesis, we would find there were parts of Genesis that were partly written by the Yahwists and partly written by the Elohists. We'd find parts of Genesis written partly by the priestly writer and partly by the Elohist writer. But somehow, this genius was able to put these together. Now, what about some of the discrepancies? Here he had a very interesting idea that we have to conclude was his idea. I think it might have been divinely inspired, and that is that even though there may be discrepancies, leave them there. Don't mess with them. If you leave out a part of the story that it comes from the Elohists, the people that read this that read the Elohists, well, I'm not going to pay attention. That doesn't have anything about our Elohists in there. The same thing would be true about the Yahwists. Say, well, you don't have our Yahweh. Well, let me give you an example. When you look at the story of Joseph, you find out that when Joseph was sold as a slave, how many of you remember, I was going through this, I realized this some weeks ago, you find out that Joseph was sold as a slave to the Ishmaelites. And then the Midianites took him to Egypt. Well, all of a sudden we have 2 different people that are involved in this slavery bit. They come from 2 different sources. The Ishmaelite story was a Yahweh story. The Midian story was an Elohist story. And what this redactor did is said, leave them both in there. The important thing that Joseph was made a slave and taken to Egypt. As far as who did it, well, nobody's going to be too concerned. But if we leave one of them out, the other one's going to be unhappy. Leave them in there. Another very good example, probably one of the prime examples that we have in the Old Testament, is the story of Noah. And I've mentioned this several times in the past few years, and that is that if you were a minister, you want to be very careful about reading the story of Noah in completion, because there are some real contradictions within the story, because it comes from 2 different sources. Let me tell you a little bit about that. If you read the story of Noah, the animals go up into the ark, 2 by 2, a pair of every animal. Go up and read a little bit further, except in one case, the clean animals had 7 pairs. Now, the clean animals with the 7 pairs were the clean animals that are described by the Elohist writer. The Elohist, I think it was the Elohist writer. The one where there were just pairs was written by the priestly writer. The reason for this was that the reason that Noah had clean animals put on the ark was that after the flood and the lands had become dry again, Moses made a sacrifice. And he made an altar, and he made a sacrifice to God, thanking God for what had happened. Now, as far as the priestly writer was concerned, there aren't going to be any clean animals brought on that ark, because you cannot perform a sacrifice unless you are an ordained priest through Aaron. In other words, the priest did not want to have that in the idea of a sacrifice, because they felt that only priests may make a sacrifice. What did this redactor do? Left both stories in. Did you worry about this? Have you lost any sleep over it? It hasn't bothered people. People still find the story of Noah as being extremely exciting in many ways. Do you know another way why that story of Noah we have in the New Testament is so exciting? Because it's only one of dozens and dozens of other stories from other parts of the world that seem to indicate that there was a great flood at one time. But that's another story. These are the things I just mentioned. These are the things that you have to take into consideration. Or I think I have. Okay. All right, I mentioned this. He combines similar stories, and he leaves everything. He doesn't leave anything out. There are certain time considerations that are very important here. When did this redaction take place? As I mentioned before, it was after the exile. Every reason to believe it didn't really take place until maybe between 450 BC and 500 BC. Actually, I should count the other way, between 500 BC and 450 BC. That's when this redaction took place. That was after the exile. This is pretty far into the history of the Jews. We read about the fact that this redaction had occurred because in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which cover that period of Jewish history, they talk about the Torah. They talk about the fact that Ezra actually read the Torah to the people at 400 BC. So by 400 BC, the Torah, the 5 books, were a unit already that was available for people to be able to read and learn about their history. This is in parentheses. There's always been the question, was Ezra the redactor? Was he the one that did this redaction? You can find pages of that on the internet to find out whether they consider Ezra as the redactor or not. Most people seem to lean toward that. All right, now let's go back. Oh, something's missing here. Let's go back to this part here. That part of the additions to the original code was this historical aspect. And what I want to do now is to take a look at what we find in Deuteronomy between chapters 1 and 11 that tell us about history of the Jews from this standpoint. From the standpoint of Moses standing up before these people and saying, you are about to go into the land of Canaan, the promised land. These are the commands that you should follow. These are the things that happened to you until you came here. And he traces their history back all the way from the time that this, the time they just before they landed in Canaan, all the way back to where? All the way back to when the Jews first left Egypt. Let's take a look at what we find in those statutes. First of all, when I was able, I've always indicated where you can find this particular part of the history in the book of Deuteronomy, and where you find it in the Torah, where you find it well, in this case it turns out to be in Numbers, and it turns out to be a Yahweh story. What is the story of these two? Well, in Deuteronomy, in the first chapter of Deuteronomy, it said that in the 40th year of the first day of it, Moses spoke to the people, right? And after he had defeated Sihon, the king, I can't read that, after he defeated Sihon, the king of the Amorites, and who lived in Heshbon, and Og, the king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtoreth, and etc. All right, what about that? Well, apparently, as far as the Jews were concerned, they were very familiar with the fact that there had been a rather significant battle that the Israelites had to that took place before they crossed the Jordan River. And it involved these two kings, this king of Og and this king of Sihon. Og was the king of an area that, well, I think I have a map that will show that. This is Og, up in here. You see here Bashan. This is the area that is around the Galilee, the Sea of Galilee. Here's the Sea of Galilee. Bashan was very, very desirable country, but the king Og in Bashan, in that area, and the king of in this area of Sihon, did not want to have those Jews, did not want those Israelites in that territory, and the Israelites had to fight for the opportunity even to get near enough to the Jordan River so that they could cross the Jordan River to get to Jericho and to get into Canaan. Og is kind of interesting from another standpoint. Oh, I'm sorry you can't see that. And I worked so hard to get this right. Og was a giant. This is a picture, believe it or not, of his bed, which was 9 feet long. And he's referred to as one of the remnants of the giants that were akin to Goliath the giant. But as far as the Israelites were concerned, this was an important part of their history, is that before they landed into Canaan, guess what? They had to defeat these two kings. And it goes all the way to chapter 11 to when we first run into the history as far as the Jews were concerned after Genesis, and that is from the standpoint of Moses coming on the scene, and Moses interacting with Pharaoh, and the situation of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt into the desert and on the way to Canaan. I'll read this. Well, you can read, no, I'm sorry, you can't read it. Then Deuteronomy actually outlines some of the things that we do actually see in the book of Deuteronomy that are very similar to the sort of things that we see in the Torah. Going back to this, the Torah has all of this outlined in Deuteronomy 11. The Torah, you find a lot of it in Exodus, mainly in Exodus chapters 5 through 14. All these stories that involve Moses and Aaron approaching Pharaoh, all these stories that involve Moses taking the Israelites out of Egypt and crossing the Red Sea, they are mentioned. Now, in between the first part of this history, which was the things that just happened, to the back with Israel leaving Egypt, there are a number of other things that are significant. Let's take a quick look at those. One of the things that is mentioned is the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments suddenly come into being in Deuteronomy. They come into Deuteronomy 5. But you know the 10 Commandments also from Exodus 20. How many of you are more familiar with Exodus 20 than with Deuteronomy 5? Yeah, I think most of us are. we're brought up with that way, we know something about the Exodus. But Deuteronomy 5 also has the Ten Commandments, and has them, well, actually, almost identical. If you take a look at some of the wording that we have in Deuteronomy 5, along with the wording that we have in Exodus 20, it's identical. You shall have no other gods before me. That's one. Number 2, thou shalt not make any graven image. 2, commandment 2. There are parts that are a bit different, however, and I'm going to go through that in just a moment. Observe the Sabbath day. Oh, yeah, that's an interesting one. Observe the Sabbath day. When you take a look at what's written in Deuteronomy 5 and you take a look at what's written in Exodus 20, they don't say the same thing. I did get a hold of this. Oh, these are the other commandments. You notice they're almost identical in 5 and 20. In Exodus 20, this is what it says. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all your work. But the seventh is the Sabbath day. Why? For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and they and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the seventh day and made it the Sabbath day. Now, how many of you learned the Ten Commandments that way? I did. That the fact that we had a Sabbath, because it tells us in the Ten Commandments that God had created had created the whole creation in 6 days and then rested the seventh day, and we are to rest the seventh day. However, when you go to I'm sorry, you can't read this. Sovic should have looked into putting blinds on those windows. How many of you know who Sovic was? Some of you know. He was the architect that designed this building. Is that right? Yeah. He didn't realize about the blinds, did he?
Well, we could move the screen.
I'll read you what is written here. In Deuteronomy 5, it reads very differently. It says that they observe the Sabbath day. Why? You shall remember that you were servants in the land of Egypt, and the Lord brought you out of thence with a mighty hand and outstretched his arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath. What does it say about the creation? Nothing. Nothing at all. There's every reason to believe that what we have in Deuteronomy 5 was the original version that we have of the Ten Commandments. The way it had been originally written, probably during the reign of Hezekiah, around 700 BC. What we have in the Torah is indicative of something else. It talks about the creation. It talks about the 7 days of the creation. Oh, I'm not over it. It talks about the 7 days of the creation. Well, where does that appear? That appears in Genesis 1. Genesis 1, folks, is one of the last things that we have in the Old Testament that was written. It probably is one of the newest parts that we have in the Old Testament. The whole idea of the 7-day creation never came into a part of the thinking of the Israelites until they were in exile in Babylon. They picked it up from where? They picked it up from the Babylonians and the Babylonians' idea of the creation. Well, the Babylonians had an idea of the creation that was not unique. There were a lot of other peoples that had ideas of how things came about. Why is all this here? The Babylonian story, however, has been authenticated in many different ways. The Babylonian story is based on one of the manuscripts that was discovered in some of the earliest archaeological work done in the 1800s. It comes from something called the Enuma Elish. Enuma Elish, I don't think I have it written down here. The Enuma Elish was a description of how the universe was created according to the Babylonians. Now, according to the Babylonians, the way the universe came about is because there was a conflict among the gods as to what should be going on. And one god took it upon himself, a god by the name, I guy, a god by the name of Marduk, took it upon himself to assign certain lesser gods as having certain responsibilities as to what part of the creation they were going to be in. Who was going to be in charge of the stars and the moon and the sun? Who was going to be in charge of the mountains, and who was going to be in charge of the oceans and all? Each of these people were given, each of these gods was given an assignment. And he managed to get this all done. And 6 days, he was so tired, you know what he did? The seventh day he rested. Now that's Marduk. That's Marduk. The Jews, when they were in Babylon, probably picked up on this story. They probably picked up on this story and thought, that is a very interesting way of looking at the creation, but we will change it. They had only one God, and they had this one God be in charge of the whole creation. But did it how? In 6 days, and what did he do? He rested on the seventh day. Now, it's kind of interesting that when we read in Exodus, we read about that creation story, indicating that whoever the redactor was able to take the Ten Commandments and say, let's change Commandment 5, the one concerning the seventh day of rest. Let's change that and incorporate the idea that we have in terms of creation coming from God in 6 days and God resting the seventh day. Indicating, I think, very strongly that what we have in the Torah, as far as the books, the stories like Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, were all very much affected by the redaction, the editing that had taken place around 500 BC. And we will find evidence of that every once in a while, that some of what we think are the oldest books actually have some of the newest material in them in terms of the redaction that had taken place. Let's go on a little bit further. Another story that we have, actually the idea of the 6 days of labor and 1 seventh day of rest, does show up I'll say it does show up in the story of manna. It actually shows up in Exodus, I think Exodus 16 or something like that, that they would pick up this manna for 6 days, but couldn't pick it up on the seventh day, indicating something that we find in the book of Exodus, indicating this idea of the sabbatical. That was one of the things that was mentioned in this. All right, this is from Deuteronomy 8. That's the book of Deuteronomy, not talking about the manna. And this is a picture of the people picking up the manna. The golden calf was another thing that was rather significant. The golden calf is covered rather extensively in Exodus chapter 12, in which Aaron takes the gold and the silver and all the things that these folks have, puts them together and builds this calf and has them worship this calf. The same story shows up where? In Deuteronomy 9. In other words, we're looking at this, again, a history, but in one case being written around 640 BC. In the other case, we're looking at a history which is using sources that are older, but were not edited until about 400 BC. Are you following me? That some of the stuff that we think is very old is certainly going to be influenced by what had happened earlier. This is the Deuteronomy story. Here's the golden calf. And this is what we find written up in Deuteronomy. And you remember that also in that story, that's when Moses destroyed the tablets that had been written. The Lord was angry with Aaron. That story is also given to us in Deuteronomy. They talk about the death of Aaron. He died. I'm pointing this out because it's rather significant to find that the death of Aaron is mentioned in Deuteronomy. It's mentioned in Deuteronomy. It's also mentioned, I think, that Aaron was involved in this golden calf. Is he mentioned there? Yeah, the Lord was angry with Aaron, and then Aaron dies. Now, one of the reasons I'm mentioning this is the following. These are the two times that Aaron is mentioned in the book of Deuteronomy. the time of the golden calf and the time of his death. 2 times Aaron is mentioned. In the Torah, Aaron is mentioned. Aaron is mentioned as standing alongside of Moses when Moses was confronting Pharaoh. As a matter of fact, it was Aaron's rod that turned into a serpent. It was Aaron that held up the rod that caused the what? The plague of the frogs. Aaron is mentioned in the Torah. He's mentioned in the Torah. In Deuteronomy, he's mentioned twice. In the Torah, he's mentioned 299 times. Now, that is very indicative of something that is very significant in terms of what we have in the Torah as far as the history of the Jews are concerned. There was an element among the Jews, among the Israelites. Maybe I should explain that word Jews. The word Jews was not really ever used until when? After they came back from exile. But when we're talking about the Israelites, we're talking about the Jews. The Jews were divided, very much divided. There were people that were very strongly inclined to believing that Aaron was a very significant part of their history. There were other Jews that felt very strongly that Moses was a significant part of their history. We want to look at that rather carefully when we look at this Deuteronomic history. Is there a question that you should be asking right now in 3 letters? Why? Why this big difference? What caused this? I thought about this many, many times of how to handle this. I will give you an illustration. We'll talk about the American Civil War, and we'll simply say the American Civil War was a war between the southern states and the northern states over a thing called slavery. That's the history of the Civil War. Actually, if you were to look at the history of the Civil War, it dates all the way back to when these Protestants settled up in Massachusetts with their Protestant religion, and some of the planters that moved into the South set up plantations based on slavery as their economy, and a division started way, way back in colonial times. Slavery versus free people. Did it ever amount to anything later on? All the way through their history, all the way up until the Civil War. You'll find that slavery was a very important issue as far as the people were concerned. The same thing is very true with this situation that we have with Moses and Aaron. There's a history that is responsible for the cause that resulted in some people being very strongly oriented and believing that Aaron was the important person here. The other group that believed very strongly, no, it was Moses. And there was this division. Have I got a minute here? I got a couple of minutes. I want to tell you a little bit further about this. There is a statement that I think I had written on one of the slides here, and that is that the book of Deuteronomy is very much concerned with Phariseeism. And some people have said that Deuteronomy and Phariseeism were devised at the same time. Now, what do they mean by that? Who were the Pharisees? The Pharisees were lay people among the Jews that studied the Torah very carefully so they could understand the laws. Oh boy, we'll get into that next week. I'm trying to understand just what does it mean to observe the Sabbath, for example. What does it mean to refrain from certain eating? What does it mean in terms of how you treat your neighbor? The Pharisees believed that the Torah gave them all the answers that they needed. The Aaronists, on the other hand, believed that their religion was based on something else. It was based on the temple in Jerusalem and based on all of the religious practices that they had about the sacrifices, the feasts that they had to attend, when they should attend them, and things of that sort. Very much a religion-oriented idea. Whereas the Pharisees were very centered on man and his relationship with God, the people that followed Aaron, or we call them the Aaronites, were very much concerned with what? how the religion was actually practiced. I'm going to be able to get into this a little bit later on when we get into the history itself. And we find out that these Aaronists were actually able to maintain control for a long time, up until about 150 BC. Managed to keep a family situation intact for almost 700 or 800 years. When the Romans came on the scene, during the time of the Maccabean Revolution, the Maccabeans started what's called the Hasmonean Dynasty. And the Hasmoneans did something that the Aaronists did not like. The Hasmoneans appointed priests who were not direct descendants of Aaron. Priests that were not direct descendants of Aaron. However, I will be pointing out later on that there was still a segment of the Jews that were Aaronists, because they depended so much on the temple, and the fact that their whole economy depended on the temple and depended on the sacrifices and all the other things associated with the temple. Even though they were not from the Aaron dynasty of the family, they did form a group that were very significant, but they did not call themselves the Aaronists. They called themselves the Sadducees. Now, if you remember the New Testament, there is always a conflict between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Pharisees thought one way about things, the Sadducees thought another thing. This is reflecting all the way back to that separation of the Moses people and the Aaron people way back in the time of the Old Testament. What happened to the Pharisees? I would gather that today there will probably be maybe close to 1 million Pharisees throughout the world who are going to pick up the Torah and study it again, and see if there isn't more that they could learn from the Torah. The Pharisees are the people that study the law and study it very carefully, and have been doing it ever since the book of Deuteronomy has been formed. What about the Sadducees? One of the things that the Sadducees did was the same thing that the people that were the Aaronists did. They kept themselves very closely allied with the ruling class. Well, in the case of the kings, there were always going to be these Aaronists, or we'll call them later on, we'll give them a different name. They were always going to be very close to the king. The same thing was true as far as the Sadducees during New Testament time. You will always find the Sadducees sitting with whoever was the governor of Jerusalem at that time. There will be Sadducees sitting there. You always find Sadducees being close to the seat of power. You also find the thing that was interesting about the Sadducees, they were among the wealthiest people in Jerusalem. Archaeologists say they can always find where a Sadducee had lived because of the opulence of the domicile in which they had. The Sadducees lived very well. An interesting thing happened. When the Jews revolted against Rome in 700 AC, this is after Christ, when the Jews rebelled against Rome, the Sadducees went along with the Jews. And after Rome had conquered the Jews in the first rebellion, as we call it, what do you hear of the Sadducees again? Nothing. They disappeared from the face of the earth. We never hear from the Sadducees again. The Pharisees, as I said today, this very day, there are going to be literally hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people who would consider themselves Pharisees, in that they are still trying to understand what the laws of Moses really were, as you find them in Deuteronomy, or as you find them in Exodus, or in some other parts of the book of the law. There is an interesting story that they tell in the New Testament about the early days of the Christian church, and that is that some of the Jews were very concerned about the way this Christianity was growing. A man by the name of Gamaliel got up. Gamaliel was the man that Paul had studied under as a Pharisee. Gamaliel got up and said, leave it alone. Don't bother with it. If these Jews, if these people that call themselves Christians are a part of God's plan, there's nothing you can do about it. It will succeed. If they are not, don't worry about it, it'll disappear. You talk about the Sadducees. Well, I won't say anything more about that, but they disappeared. There was something about the Aaronist approach that was different from the Mosaic approach that the whole idea did disappear. The thing that I found rather interesting is how important this whole idea of this separation of the people that were followers of Moses and Aaron really became throughout the rest of the writing of the Old Testament. And as we go through the history, we will be looking more at that sort of thing. Next week, what I want to do, however, is to go back to those chapters 11 through 26 and take a look at what was written in the law and what were the things that we read in the law that people are still studying to this very day. And I think most of you are aware that a good practicing Orthodox Jew follows some aspects of the law very carefully. Will a good Orthodox Jew eat a ham and cheese sandwich? No. For one thing, he cannot mix meat and cheese and milk products in the same meal. And the other is that he would never eat anything that's big. A good Jew would do that. Would a good Orthodox Jew today pay very close attention to the Sabbath? Yes, he'll pay very close attention. There are people that are following the laws that we find in the Torah, the laws that we find in Deuteronomy, even to this very day. Next week we want to talk about that and talk about why the laws and following the laws are so important to so many of the Orthodox Jews. Until next week, hopefully no visits to the doctors or anything. I would stay away from doctors as much as I can.